war nobody's watching for. Why Turkey, not Iran, could break the world.
Everyone keeps pointing at the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point that controls roughly a third of the world's seaborne oil supply. And I get it, that's a real threat. But while every analyst, every news channel, and every geopolitical podcast is staring at that one stretch of water, something much bigger is being set up right in front of us. The country that could actually pull the thread that unravels everything isn't Iran, it's Turkey. And almost nobody is talking about it. To understand why, you first have to throw out the old map, because the old framework doesn't work anymore. People still explain the Middle East through the Iran versus Saudi Arabia lens. Shia versus Sunni, Tehran versus Riyadh. That was accurate for a decade, but what's happening now is different. The proxy layer has been stripped away. What's emerging is bloc versus bloc, and the lines are hardening fast. On one side you have India, Israel, and the UAE, quietly coordinated, economically tied together, functioning as a strategic unit even without a formal alliance. On the other side, you have Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Qatar. Not a traditional military alliance, more of a gravitational pull, a Sunni realignment in motion. And sitting at the center of that realignment is Erdogan. Now I'm going to say something direct. I think Erdogan is a wannabe Sunni tyrant. And that's not just an opinion. The facts back it up. This is a man who has spent 20 years systematically dismantling the secular foundations that Ataturk built when he created modern Turkey. When a coup attempt happened in July 2016, which Erdogan himself called a gift from God, he used it as a blank check. Over 150,000 military officers, judges, academics, teachers, and civil servants were dismissed, detained, or suspended in the aftermath. Not properly investigated. Gone. A government official admitted in early 2025 that many of those dismissed weren't even directly linked to the coup. They were removed because a software program flagged them as critics of Erdogan. Then, in 2017, he rewrote the constitution entirely, eliminating the prime minister's role and concentrating all executive authority in himself. As of 2025, Reporters Without Borders says 90% of Turkish media is controlled by his government. Turkey ranks 159th out of 180 countries in press freedom. And yet, he remains inside NATO, a full member, with access to intelligence sharing, military cooperation, and crucially, a veto over who else gets to join. He used that veto to block Sweden and Finland from joining NATO for over a year, squeezing concessions out of both Washington and Stockholm before finally allowing their membership. That's not an ally, behaving like an ally. That's someone using alliance membership as a personal bargaining chip. The cultural moves he's made are just as telling. Converting Hagia Sophia back into a mosque in 2020, after it had been a neutral museum for 86 years, wasn't purely a religious decision. It was a message to the entire Muslim world. It said, Turkey is not a Western-facing secular democracy. Turkey is the successor to an empire, the inheritor of Sunni leadership in a region that doesn't have a clear one right now. And to hammer that message home even further, he went and purchased Russia's S-400 missile defense system. A move so provocative, it nearly got Turkey removed from the F-35 fighter jet program entirely. He bought a Russian weapons system while sitting inside a Western military alliance that tells you everything about how Erdogan operates. But then Syria happened, and that changed everything. When the rebel coalition, led by the group HTS, swept through Aleppo, Hama, and ultimately Damascus in late November and December of 2024, forcing Bashar al-Assad to flee to Moscow, it looked like a local power shift. It was actually a structural earthquake. Think about what it revealed. Russia was completely consumed by Ukraine, not strategically hesitant, physically incapable of responding. Their military resources, Their attention, their logistics were all locked into a war that had been draining them for nearly 3 years. When Assad's army started collapsing, Russia simply had nothing left to send. They didn't choose to leave him stranded. They were already stretched so thin that they couldn't show up. Even when the walls were caving in, Assad fell not because Russia decided to walk away, but because Russia was already too broken by Ukraine to save him when it mattered. That distinction is important, and we'll come back to it. Hezbollah was in the same position. Iran's most important regional instrument had been pulled into its own grinding conflict with Israel in Lebanon, taking serious losses, losing key commanders, and unable to project the kind of force it once had. And Iran, which spent years building an arc of influence, from Tehran through Baghdad, through Damascus, through Beirut, to Gaza, suddenly found the central link of that arc broken completely. Assad was the connective tissue. Without him, Iran's land corridor into Lebanon and the Mediterranean is severed. Without him, the axis of resistance that Iran spent decades constructing doesn't just weaken, it fractures. Russia, for its part, lost access to its Mediterranean naval base at Tartus and its air operations hub at Khmeimim. Syria was Russia's only significant hard power position in the Arab world, and Syria has since cancelled Russia's port lease at Tartus entirely, ending Moscow's Mediterranean footprint. Russia is now sheltering Assad in Moscow and refuses to hand him over, not out of loyalty, but because handing him over would be an admission of failure. They can't politically survive. So they're stuck protecting a symbol of a losing position they cannot escape. Here's what this means going forward. If Russia couldn't come to Assad's rescue because Ukraine had already exhausted them, the same logic applies to Iran. If Iran comes under serious pressure, Russia won't make a strategic decision to abandon them. They simply won't have the capacity to help. And that amounts to the same outcome. Iran is increasingly a partner that Russia cannot afford to protect. The rebel groups that brought Assad down had been operating for years under Turkish protection in Idlib. Turkey's intelligence chief flew into Damascus almost immediately after Assad fell and met directly with the new Syrian leadership. Even Trump said publicly that Turkey holds the key to Syria. This puts Turkey in a position that is genuinely extraordinary. It's a NATO member that maintained a functioning military and trade relationship with Russia throughout the Ukraine war, buying their weapons and keeping commerce flowing while the West sanctioned Moscow. It now has more influence in post-Assad Syria than any other country on earth. And it controls the Bosphorus, the only maritime passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, giving it a chokehold over Russian naval movement that it can tighten or loosen whenever it chooses. Erdogan has turned Turkey into a country that is indispensable to both sides simultaneously. In a world where the old order is breaking down and new coalitions are still forming, that is an enormous amount of power. Here's the question almost nobody is seriously asking. What happens when Erdogan is gone, and he won't be around forever? His 2023 election was the closest of his career. Inflation has hit Turkish households hard. The secular, Western-oriented tradition in Turkish politics, the one he has spent 20 years suppressing, has not disappeared. It's reorganizing. At some point, through a lost election or a collapsing coalition, Erdogan goes. And the most likely outcome is a Turkey that genuinely realigns with NATO, done with the S-400. Done using the Bosphorus as a personal bargaining chip, actually open with Washington. For Russia, that's not a setback, that's an existential shift. The one NATO member that gave Moscow a buffer, a back channel, and a commercial lifeline flips fully to the other side. And that's exactly when China enters the picture. Beijing has been patient on Taiwan not because the desire isn't there, but because timing is everything. You don't make that move when America is focused. You make it when Washington is stretched and when Europe is shaky. Turkey's realignment, pushing Russia toward escalation, layered on top of an already volatile Middle East. That's the distributed chaos that opens the window for Beijing. And once China moves on Taiwan, every Pacific Alliance commitment activates. Japan, South Korea, Australia, the US, fall treaty-bound. None of it quietly ignoble. And suddenly, it's not a regional conflict anymore. I'm not selling panic, and I'm not saying this is inevitable. What I'm saying is that the threat everyone is watching, Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, a Gulf flashpoint, is the visible risk. And in geopolitics, the crises you see coming are almost never the ones that break the system. Turkey is a NATO member with a Russian weapons system, dominant influence over post-Assad Syria, and a physical chokehold on the only waterway in and out of the Black Sea, all under a leader who built his entire identity around being irreplaceable. The day he's gone, every deal, every balance, every line he walked becomes renegotiable overnight. And that transition is the real wild card, not the strait, the succession. Keep your eyes on Turkey.